This is Digital Voices with Beau Tiffany, inspiring and providing real insight to our listeners with every story. Please welcome your host, Beau Tiffany.
Hi, Gene. Thanks for coming on Digital Voices. How you doing?
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. It's your analytical mind that I want to pick for some of the topics that we're going to be discussing today.
I can think of a few. I appreciate the compliment. I really do.
What we're going to be jumping into is the Virgin Islands. Before we do, find out a little bit about your roots. Where are you from originally?
Sure. So I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York, born and raised there. Graduated from Manhattan College with a bachelor's in government. Went to Quinnipiac University School of Law, got my law degree there. Been a practicing civil attorney since about 2005. And somehow through that, I got roped into getting involved in politics. When I first got into the local Republican Party apparatus in Brooklyn, New York, my first day in, I was appointed a vice chairman of the law committee. And from there, I learned about election law, became a little bit of an election law expert, began to litigate getting people on the ballot, access to the ballot cases, which would help me with my appellate practice, and also would litigate some recounts, including a recount for a state Senate race that ended up being the closest election in state Senate history in New York. Wow. My guy won by 12 votes. It was that close, out of 50,000 votes. So that kind of got me involved in politics, but it also got me involved with doing a little bit of radio work and podcasting and content creating. And luckily, the people involved there would like what I was doing, to the point where it evolved into sort of a private passion of mine. And we created my friends and I created a whole idea of what is a political buffoon, which ultimately turned into a book that I wrote that was an Amazon #1 bestseller, and turned into a YouTube channel that has now been exploding out. I think we're over 1,100 subscribers now after about a month and a half of doing it. So it's going really well. And I like to talk about mocking politicians, and it's fun.
Yeah. And one of the things I've been dealing with on my show is mental health and politics. We get to a certain level with the Marjorie Green Taylors and such. We've become so radical in our approach. You take a look at that in our State of the Union, where we're swearing at our presidents and calling him a liar, to other forums where we never saw that type of political discourse before. We've seen a lot, but not quite to this extreme. Do you think that came with Trump, or was it just in motion before Trump, which is what had got ultimately him into office with his popularity?
Oh, goodness, no. It had nothing to do with Trump. Political discourse being this sort of out of control is nothing new. In my book that I wrote, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, I found instances where there would be brawls breaking out between candidates back as early as the 1820s, where candidates would literally have guns and knives out, their side against the other side, fighting it out at the polls, to the point where people would die in these sorts of brawls. This is nothing new. In fact, a lot of this is tame compared to what happened during the initial upbringing of our country. But there's always been, we like to think that we live in interesting times. And while we do, because of technology and those aspects, what we see in politics right now, this is a tale as old as time for American political culture. It's nothing really new. It may be more amplified now because we have a 24/7 news cycle. We have so much access to information, and we may be seeing it more and more in our faces, but it's nothing new in politics.
There seems to be this overwhelming sense of doom that seems to permeate our news and our country amongst our own community discourse, if you will. Is that warranted, or is that just people making anxiety and stress for themselves in areas that they should?
Well, there's more than one cause for that. I think that because there's more information available to everybody, people are seeing sort of the warts of politics now. They're not seeing what only the three major news networks would tell you for the past 40 years, like going from the 50s into the 90s, until we had this explosion of national cable news and the internet and independent journalism and everything that has come along with the growth of technology. So the access to information probably makes people a little more anxious because they're seeing things that they didn't see before, especially localized information. But also, we have a lot of media now that is not so much driven by getting facts and information out, but in catering to an audience. We have activist journalism now, probably more so than any other time, including the days of yellow journalism at the turn of the 20th century. But also you have partisan journalism trying to excite a base into action and activity. Again, it's like gang warfare. You got their side and the other side that kind of clash on these ideas. Everyone has a perspective. No one can agree on what that perspective is. And it creates a greater divide. Meanwhile, all the people in power and influence are cashing in on this. There's certainly enough factual, objective news to be worried about. But I think that the partisan rhetoric that goes along with the politicos and the prognosticators, that is what is making the divide even more expansive than we actually think it is.
Shifting gears a little bit, I find all of that interesting, and some of it I think applies to the U.S. Virgin Islands. The reason that I had you on today is to get your insights on some of the issues that are going on in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Obviously, it's well known for Jeffrey Epstein and the scandals that went on, but what's lesser known is the legal culture of the Virgin Islands that, in my opinion, let Jeffrey Epstein set up shop in the first place, knew about it, and still continues to operate within the U.S. Virgin Islands without Epstein. Not necessarily in sex trafficking, but in other ways. And those are some of the things I'd like to discuss today.
Okay. Listen, obviously, this is a topic that's off the beaten path. So I had to do a little bit of research into the topic when we first discussed talking about this. And what I found was it's the history of the U.S. Virgin Islands and their organizational setup. The establishment of the territorial government there through the Organic Act seems to be the start of the deficiency, because it doesn't seem there's enough government there to support the needs of the populace. There are some basic tenets of government that don't exist in the Virgin Islands that we sort of take it for granted here in the United States. One example of that to me, and this is, I'm going to take you on a little bit of a ride here, so I'll get to Epstein in a second, but just bear with me on this. There is no speedy trial law, for example, in the U.S. Virgin Islands. That's something we seem to take for granted in every other jurisdiction in the mainland United States and basically within the United States as a whole. So the idea that there's been a backlog, I've seen a backlog of cases going back to the 90s and even beyond that, discussions in appellate decisions from the third district, seeing that there's this backlog of judicial cases in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Today, I think it stands at there's something like 800 criminal cases. Keep in mind, a population of a little over 100,000 people, there's a backlog of 800 to 1,000 cases at any time in their court system. They don't have enough judges. They don't have enough public defenders. They don't have enough court staff. There's 3 judges that are appointed by the governor. And just by even saying that, appointed by the governor means that there is room for political corruption to occur there. When you have appointments from elected officials to elected officials and on an island of 100,000 people, you're going to have everybody knows everybody, and they're looking the other way at these things for corruption. But with Epstein, the Epstein situation seems to be quite unique in that everybody, and by everybody, the U.S. Virgin Islands and the federal criminal justice system and even private institutions like J.P. Morgan Chase are all seemingly pointing the fingers at each other. There's currently a federal case going on in Manhattan Federal Court where the U.S. Virgin Islands is trying to get something like $190 million from J.P. Morgan Chase for claiming that they were helping Epstein get money. And J.P. Morgan Chase is counterclaiming, basically saying that the U.S. Virgin Islands was helping Epstein by giving him tax breaks, by looking the other way at his sex offender status and allowing him to set up shop there. And they're pointing the fingers at each other. Virgin Islands is about a closed insular population where everyone seems to know everybody else, especially those in power. And there's very little oversight done by DOJ or anyone within the federal government that seem to be leaving the U.S. Virgin Islands to their own devices.
That's exactly right. People are less likely to be outspoken about what we're talking about today. In my particular case, I was vexatiously sued multiple times under pro se by the dirty attorneys. It turned out that they never got my medical records, never got my medical bills, didn't do their due diligence, settled for next to nothing, and I had a brain injury. And so I just totally got taken advantage. On top of that, they ended up stealing my settlement. There's only one office in the Virgin Islands that could take care of something like that, and that's called the Office of Disciplinary Counsel. If you file a complaint and you release that you filed a complaint, you're in trouble. They'll throw the book at you. The civil cases are where there's no specialized court structures to deal with like victims of sex crime and things like that. So they're all lumped underneath civil case, which is the U.S. Virgin Islands Superior Court, which sounds like a district court, like a federal court, but that's what they call their state court. The district court is actually the federal court. Those tend to turn over cases on a different speediness and attention than the civil cases do. Civil cases, because of that timeline, my particular case has been going on for almost 7 years, 201 court dockets, not a single hearing to address any of them. And then I had an investigator who, I got to be careful about how I phrase this. There was an investigation done on a person, and they found in this person's favor. The board for the Office of Disciplinary Counsel then sat on those findings for over a year, despite investigator requests for movement. And then once they decided to fire him or let the investigator go, he resigned the day after this particular set of incidents. So this investigator investigated a case, handed in his findings, recommended disbarment. The ODC board sat on that for over a year, despite multiple requests for movement. The investigator then requested a new board. The old board then notified the respondents, breaking the confidentiality, alerting them that they're going to have a new board. The respondents then asked for an extension of time, where the investigator still court issued a series of demand letters. Yes, they said, Gene.
I'm sure they said that they can't help you, something like that.
They didn't even answer.
Really? Okay.
Can you imagine that? You get a demand letter from the court and they don't answer it. And then they pended that grievance upon the civil case for this person. As we know, those civil cases are going back into 2000 or into the 90s even. So it's a way to allow the guilty to then still operate with impunity. Other thing I have to mention regarding the ODC aspect is that they have only a part-time investigator to handle the current and past caseload. Obviously, I think this is an intentional rather than, just not having the resources. The U.S. Virgin Islands brings in nearly $4 billion every year from tourism and others, such business practices. The thing about the Virgin Islands, though, is that you mentioned the island has 100,000 residents on paper, but the people that are there actually year round, it's only 50,000. Because if you're a U.S. Virgin Island resident, you have a huge tax break regarding any type of taxes that you have to pay in. So that's why they set up the shell companies in the first place. The other thing that I think is interesting about this area is it's also a stopping point for Colombia and cocaine trafficking. It's a huge thing out there. And so every year you hear stories of police corruption or legal corruption or misappropriation of funds or something along those lines. But there has not been a lot brought to light regarding this timeline. There's thousands of people, or 800. I'm not sure. I actually haven't been able to figure out the exact number. You might have been more privy to that. I'll go with the 800. So that's still a heck of a lot of families waiting in limbo for justice that never comes. And the Virgin Islands is supposed to operate underneath the federal and constitutional laws for the United States. And even though they have their Organic Act, which creates kind of their own independence that took place in 1937, I believe, that gets confusing, or at least muddies the waters a little bit. For victims, you have to find someone from the Virgin Islands to represent you in the Virgin Islands. Any mainstream attorneys, mainline, don't want to touch it. It's too far away. It's too expensive. Variety of issues.
Mm-hmm.
So the victims are really left without recourse. And me being a victim have found out that many of the victims are also Jeffrey Epstein's victims as well. When you see the Office of Disciplinary Counsel acting in such ways, I've had communication with the FBI confirming a lot of these things I've told you. At least there's an acknowledgement that this is happening from the right people. But there doesn't seem to be any federal oversight to create solutions for us. Instead, it just continually gets worse. When you have a civil case that's nearly 30 years old, people can die before it's ever even brought to court. The lingering delays and the breach of rights, could these possibly be strategic moves to let certain crime statutes lapse, or even just to continue to operate with impunity.
If there are cases already charged that are in the court system, that means that they brought the charges within the statute of limitations that are applicable for those charges. So those cases are going to lapse in that respect. With civil cases, the one thing I would say to do that is, if you are not a citizen of the Virgin Islands, if you are from outside of there, try to have your case removed to federal court. You have what's known as diversity jurisdiction, where the federal courts would have to hear cases between citizens of different states and territories of the United States. So if you're from, let's say, the People's Republic of New York, and something happened in the Virgin Islands and you choose to sue down there, go to federal court down there with the much stricter timetables. And the courts will have stricter penalties for missing deadlines. Federal court is very much a creature of schedule and deadlines. So definitely use the federal resources down there. If you're a citizen of the U.S. Virgin Islands, you're probably stuck with dealing with your state court based upon the Organic Act of 1954. By the way, they revised it from 37 to 54, so we're operating under that. And Stacey Plaskett, who is the designee from the U.S. Virgin Islands, you may have seen her in the Weaponization of Government Select Committee hearings. She's been pushing to have the Organic Act converted over to a constitution for the U.S. Virgin Islands, which would basically be the same thing they have in a different format, sort of form over substance. I don't really see how that would help anything. But what would help is what the government of Great Britain did for the British Virgin Islands. They had an external investigation of what was going on in the British Virgin Islands to crack down on corruption. DOJ, and specifically Delia Smith, the recently appointed U.S. attorney for the Virgin Islands, she has the power and the budget to be able to go through what is happening in the territory and root out the corruption. The Virgin Islands, they're beholden to the legislature, which is basically 15 people, for their budget for looking at corruption and other irregularities in the operations of government. They don't get that funding, but the DOJ can. The DOJ is not answerable to any local authority, and their budget comes from Washington. So they can step in and they can investigate externally to see exactly what's going on. It worked for the British Virgin Islands. It should work for the U.S. Virgin Islands as well.
So I tried dealing with the DOJ. My particular situation, I mentioned that my medical records weren't clean during the tenure of my representation. They ended up deleting them after they were investigated because they didn't have them and they were requested. After representation had ended, which I brought to the DOJ, they never did anything. That's here in Wisconsin, 10-year sentence and up to $100,000 fine, especially with a fraudulent form and for the reasons that they did obtain them. So I followed up with the DOJ and I never get a phone call back. I never get an email back. I've had an investigator in the U.S. Virgin Islands that really stepped out of his role to try to help me. And he also couldn't find anyone in that area. I tried doing that with the FBI. They said that's not their job, that they needed to fix their issues via elections and legislation rather than going in and trying to fix the island. That's not the FBI's job, is what they said. They said there's not a nexus. Although for me, it would seem that the nexus is delayed justice, the people that are involved with that. And it's such an egregious thing because the USVI is supposed to honor constitutional codes. And one of the constitutional rights that we have is a right to speedy trial, a right to representation, all these things that we're not able to get in the Virgin Islands. And what I find more troubling too is that there's, what is it, 15 representatives, each making $150,000 for a population of technically 100,000, but more like 50,000. And then we have the governor and the judges and all the people that work in the government of the USVI cost-wise. If you can afford to have 15 representatives for 100,000 population per representative, that breaks down to be almost just a handful of constituents that you're representing. You're still getting 150,000. I feel like that needs to be structured in a way that they bring in the people that they need. They feel like this has been it's almost a mirage. They want the appearance like they're doing their job, but when you actually dig into things, then you see how grossly negligent it actually is. And for the victims of Jeffrey Epstein, can you imagine? He's dead. This is now 2019 that it was broke. So we're looking at almost 5 years. And you're not able to get anywhere in your court cases, and you're stuck in limbo. And you hear that these court cases are stretching back to the 90s. Criminal trials are taking 12 years on average to come to get in front of the judge, according to the FBI.
The good thing that could come from the whole Jeffrey Epstein saga is that New York is another jurisdiction you could look to for at least a civil recompense against Jeffrey Epstein and his estate, because he was a resident of New York. That's why the criminal proceeding for Ghislaine Maxwell happened in New York. So there is that nexus there as well that people can turn to, especially if people were transported from a state in the mainland or from the 50 states to the Virgin Islands. Those jurisdictions are available for them as well. The problem becomes if there were any victims that were native to the U.S. Virgin Islands, what they would see. Now, I will say that there have been calls for additional funding for the judiciary in the Virgin Islands. The head of the judiciary has asked for the appointment of 2 additional judges and additional staff, and they wanted an increase in budget. Whether they got it, I'm not sure. But they're looking to expand the courts to be able to just cover basic judiciary functions. You would think that in today's day and age, with the advent of Zoom and remote court appearances that we all had during COVID, and I got to think that COVID had something to do with the backlashes as well, by the way. Let's not discount that. But I got to think that with all the advances we've had in communications, and especially secure communications for the judiciary, I know that in New York, I can appear via Microsoft Teams and have a secure connection to the court and handle business that way. I've argued motions that way. I've made court appearances that way. No reason why that can't happen with the U.S. Virgin Islands as well. If they just look to expand those programs, the federal courts do it and have done it during the pandemic. So there's no reason why they can't do that. To me, if they hire more staff, you got a choice of 2 outcomes. Either they're going to hire more cronies and nothing's going to get done, or they're actually going to hire in some people that might get things done for a little while before the cronies take over and tamp down their enthusiasm. It's like the Wild West. You're not going to get any change within the Wild West. You had to get change externally from the Wild West. That's why U.S. Marshals had to come in to bring law and order to the West. It wasn't being done by the local sheriff in Dodge County. It was done externally. That's why I keep pointing to Delia Smith and to the Biden administration and to the DOJ, that they can pick up this ball. I know that the FBI said that it's not their job, but they can certainly pick up this ball and have their own investigation done here. If we can investigate Hunter Biden and then all of a sudden have a special counsel investigated a couple of days after you have a sweetheart plea deal, then why can't you have some sort of special investigation into the U.S. Virgin Islands, give it a budget, have them investigate, have them come back with a report, maybe bring charges against some of those local officials who are corrupt, if they find such corruption, and handle it that way. And that'll send a message that the federal government is watching over its territories and are not just being left to their own devices.
You brought up a great point, which is one I was going to ask. RICO is a profound tool just for this type of investigation. I get with Epstein, it was never used, to my knowledge. I find that it blows my mind that we know that Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were not, that's not the way corruption works. It's an affiliation. We know now, especially after Denise George from the U.S. Virgin Islands had even announced that there were people that were in the government that knew about it, that didn't do anything about it. The fact that the way that I look at it is that this is a kind of snake nest. That I'm completely wrong on that. It's just an outside person looking in. But if that's the case, Epstein's presence and the power was able to shape the legal system of the U.S. Virgin Islands, that would be a hard thing to break. But such a small area, easily controllable to a certain extent. If you do have bad players, like how Vegas was back in the day with Mafia, how do we get past that? RICO would seem to be the one tool that could really help us, but they're not willing to use it.
There are many tools at the to the disposal of someone externally looking at what's going on in a local government. Again, one tool was the Inspector General for the U.S. Virgin Islands, but they don't get a budget from the government. And again, it's this idea of everybody knows everybody, so everybody's going to look the other way, because if I look the other way when so-and-so is doing something, if I try to do something, they'll look the other way from me. And there's this whole self-aggrandizing society that develops. When you get a society, like you said, a snake den like that is suitable for those conditions for the snakes to thrive, do you really expect the snakes to be able to say, that's it for us, we should straighten out and fly right? That doesn't happen. It never happens. It doesn't matter whether you're in a corporation, a state government, a federal government, a local government, or a territory. It's not going to happen that way. Bad actors aren't going to correct themselves. There needs to be an external force correcting them. RICO may be a tool if they find that there is some sort of organized crime aspect to it, but it could also be what they call a standalone complex. It's everybody's acting in their own self-interest, and they act collectively together going in that same direction without any sort of coordination between them. So we don't know exactly what it is, which is why an investigation, if Delia Smith went to the DOJ tomorrow and said, we're seeing this going on, A, B, C, and D, and we believe that at least an inquiry should be started by our office to see what's going on, and get approval for that, that's a great start. And then whatever that inquiry turns out, maybe it'll turn into a full-blown investigation. And that would give them the impetus to ask for an independent counsel to be able to investigate everything going on in all jurisdictions and how they may be affecting what's going on in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Again, this is a topic that I've only become aware of based upon the idea of having this discussion with you. But the more that you see there, the more that there should be enough of an impetus here, enough of an indication that external force like a DOJ, especially when you have an office there in the Virgin Islands, who is with an appointee from the Virgin Islands, who should want to care about what's going on there. That should be enough of an impetus to say, let's at least start inquiring about what's going on. Again, I never see, and I've done research into this in my book, I've never seen corruption rooted out internally. There's always been some sort of external force, whether it be another jurisdiction coming in or the media doing an independent investigation, uncovering details that spark some other interest in it. That's what roots out corruption. It's never done from within. It always comes from without.
That's a great segue. So let's talk about your book, and let's talk about the other types of corruption or maybe similar places to the U.S. Virgin Islands that you might have seen and be aware of. Your book touches on a lot, and I think your experience that you bring out within it is profound.
Thank you for that. The name of the book is Schnooks, Crooks, Liars, and Scoundrels, a field guide to identifying political buffoons. It's currently available on Amazon, at Barnes & Nobles, and other online bookstores. The whole idea of the book was, from being involved in politics in New York City, what I found is that every election cycle, we're duped into believing that these people are going to be different than the last crop of buffoon that we had in office. What my friends and I would do when we worked in politics, I made a wonderful group of friends that were volunteers on campaigns, that were appointed to party positions, that saw the same thing that I was. And we would actually talk about what these buffoons are, the type of buffoonery we're seeing, whether it be the innocuous, overconfident buffoon that you see that is really not that skilled, to the most irredeemable, the corrupt. We looked at and compared these types of buffoons to see what kind of characteristics do these buffoons have that make them who they are, and what we should look out for when we're looking to vote for people like this. It started out as a joke, honestly, and we had this pseudoscience that we totally made up called buffoonology, but it turned into a serious discussion about political leadership, ranging from, like I said, the overconfident buffoon, or the buffoon that uses emotion rather than intelligence to make their points to scare people, or the celebrity buffoon that has their own career fading, but is looking to politics as a second career to take up causes that they know nothing about, or that sort of radioactive worst case scenario buffoon. And all points that the radioactive one that infects the buffoonery of other people spreads out radioactively and infects other people. to all points in between. And what I did in my book was I discussed what I believe to be the characteristics of each type of these buffoons are. I gave an example from American history and from today, and we had to find a lodestar of buffoonery to compare all these other buffoons to, the perfect buffoon, if you will. And we all agreed in my circle of friends that the perfect buffoon of all time to compare every other buffoon to is the Reverend Al Sharpton. Because the Reverend Al has been every single type of buffoon that you can imagine throughout the course of his career, whether it be just, the most innocuous buffoon to the most radioactive. In all, like I said, in all points in between. So this discusses hypocrisy, lack of self-awareness, all the things of today's politicians, and how to recognize those toxic traits before they get back into office, or they get into office to begin with.
I feel like we almost need a mental health test before someone actually can run. The discourse that we've been seeing across the aisle, and while you made a great point that's been going on forever, whether it's just the media attention and the accessibility to actually see it firsthand, it's shocking. Because growing up, I always had this, whether true or false, this impression that the president was very dignified. He could talk eloquently, able to go to different countries and represent ours in a way that I felt was honorable, put a good light on who America or Americans are. That's changed a lot, especially in the last years.
It's changed a lot in that we see it more often. But just as an example, our second president, John Adams, would go around calling George Washington old muttonhead, would call Alexander Hamilton the bastard son of a Scotch peddler, and basically went to war with his own cabinet in 1800 over the XYZ affair going on overseas. This has been happening forever. In all honesty, the past 20 years or so, politics has become so pervasive in our lives that we have to pay attention. You can't not pay attention to politics now. There used to be a time when everyone got along and it was a little more dignified, at least on the surface, that you didn't have to worry about what was going on in politics every day. Now we have feeds from every committee hearing in Congress every day going on that we can all access on YouTube. We can see the arguments going back and forth and how stupid people are. We see the arguments being put forth in the media, and we have clips going around with the gotcha moments from this one or the other one, depending on your perspective. And we have an open war in media for the identity of the country and what partisan viewpoint is available out there. And they're peddling to the populace that is confirming that bias. So it's a lot more open now, but it's always, like I said, it's always been there. Honestly, I think it all got really bad when we started giving journalists bylines, when journalists started getting credit for their work in newspapers, the William Randolph Hearsts of the time and the yellow journalists of the turn of the century, when they started putting their names on bylines and they became part of the story instead of just reporting the story. We don't have a lot of people out there just reporting the story, but we have plenty of people out there like Geraldo Rivera, like Jim Acosta, like Joe Scarborough, who are inputting themselves into the story rather than reporting what's going on. And it's that sort of punditry and prognostication of politics that has really blurred the line between news and feature and opinion and all that. So it's a self-perpetuating cycle, but it's always been there, just not as covered as it is today.
That's such a fascinating thing, because I personally thought it was more recent, and the examples that you brought out really hit home for me. People are people, and if anything, maybe the extra spotlight on them so that people can see what actually is going on in some way will make things better, just because of the transparency becomes accountability.
Yeah, I think awareness is the key. I think awareness of the population is the key to know that when they're being BS'd by someone. That is what my book is trying to do, is to bring awareness of these toxic traits that people have to show their own true colors before they get into office. Yeah. We think about today, all the scandals going on in culture, but we don't really think about how scandals happened during the administration of Andrew Jackson with the petticoat affair, and how it was like the Real Housewives of the Potomac back then going after this one woman who was seen to be less virtuous than the wife of the vice president wanted her to be. Or one of my favorite stories from the book is the story of a New York senator named Roscoe Conkling, who his claim to fame was being this senatorial Apollo. They call him the Apollo of the Senate. But really, during a court case, he ended up being laughed at by the crowd when he made a comment about how not everyone is perfect or whatever, because he was involved in a scandal of sleeping with the wife of a former governor. And he ended up getting caught by that governor. The governor chasing him out of the mansion with a shotgun, and he had to jump out the window to escape this governor. So it was, the Real Housewives of the time was in the newspapers because they didn't have any other media. But it's always been there. The scandals of the rich and famous have always been there. The uncivil nature of politics has always been there. Thomas Jefferson even once complained about the press and how he wished that he could lock up journalists. So when you hear Donald Trump saying that, it's not a new form of toxic political speak. It's a return of toxic political speak that just we don't know our own history about. And hopefully by bringing up these traits to people, we can have more citizens starting to see through politicians and their BS and can recognize, oh, this one's being a hypocrite because I remember this scandal that they did, or wow, what a shocking lack of self-awareness to say that you're a 1027th Cherokee. That things like that politicians could have gotten away with 30, 40 years ago. They can't get away with it now.
You have such a great perspective behind the scenes that many of us just don't have the opportunity to get exposed to.
This is because I saw how the sausage was made by picking candidates locally in Brooklyn, seeing how campaigns went, seeing how the local board of elections worked, and the hyper-partisan nature of ballot access and things like that, seeing how the courts worked when you would try to get ballot access after they made a decision or having to go up to the level to the appellate division. When you see how the sausage is made, you get very jaded when it comes to politics, to the point where I want nothing to do with institutional politics ever again. Even though I'm good at it and I was able to get people elected and I was able to help some of the bad guys win, in my opinion, there is this sense that I gained that really hit me in the face when I went into institutional politics, and seeing the grift, seeing the glad handing and the back and forth, and how there really are no angels in politics. That really smacked the idealism out of me, but it also gave me hope that I can do something from the outside to point out, hey guys, this is what's really going on behind the curtain.
I think that's great that you allow us that access and that you put yourself out there like that. I think that's amazing. I've had Rob Hausman, ex-senior White House official underneath Clinton on recently. I also had Christine Sinicki, state representative from Wisconsin. And one of the things that we were talking about is parties don't talk to one another. Here in Wisconsin, Republicans are the main party. So Democrats, when they are releasing legislation or doing their talks on the floor, usually the Republicans aren't even in the room. They feel that they don't have to work with the Democrats here in Wisconsin and they're all lockstep. So if anybody falls out of line, they're going to get primary. I guess that leads me to, how do we get past this 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, staying on the same spot, which is been seen for decades. It seems the idea of the president's change, which is great, but then when someone else gets in, then they try to repeal everything the previous person did. It's a vicious cycle. How can we work together in a constructive way rather than this rhetoric that's been going on for the last decades now without any movement?
Boy, I thought you were going to ask me a hard question like how to solve world peace or something. So really, it depends from state to state. We have 50 different state elections. And we don't have 50 different state elections. We have 500 or so local elections based upon your own assembly district, or in New York, it's set up by assembly district. And then you have even smaller subsets within that. And it's all segmented different ways and cut every which way to Sunday, depending upon local races, state races, county races, statewide races, national races. You have to start locally. I think the Republican approach of going to school boards and trying to work from there is a good start. You need to build a bench of people who are responsible to the people who elect them, who do not get corrupted by the party line. Let's face it, we don't go down the line in everything that we do. It should be more like that Chinese menu. You pick something from column A that you like, something from column B that you like, you put it together, and you got something good. That's one thing that has to be done. It has to be more interest at the local level, starting out with, and growing a bench of responsible, honest people who go into office with a set of beliefs that reflects those people. Then when you get to higher office and you end up having to deal with politicians who are doing the same thing, but from an opposite perspective, a different partisan perspective, we have to make compromise not a dirty word anymore. The idea of compromise is that you both walk away with less than what you want, but you got some of what you want. Lawyers do this all the time with arbitration, mediation, settlement negotiations. You don't always get what you want, but sometimes you just might find you get what you need. And that should be the goal now. The goal shouldn't be a zero-sum game. Politics is not a zero-sum game. It's a game where everybody gets a little bit, and hopefully the ultimate beneficiary is the maximum number of people. That's what it should be all about. The last thing it should be about is, the last thing we should do is a return to a growth of common culture. There used to be a time back when I was growing up, and I'm not that old, I'm in my mid-40s, but it was a time back in the 80s and 90s where we had a unified culture in America. We all watched the Super Bowl, we all watched the Academy Awards, we all partook in American culture together. There's been this divisive fragmentation of culture, and these different fragments don't like what they now call appropriation of culture. One perfect example, I am a huge fan of jazz. I grew up listening to it. I am very proud to say that during the late 50s, early 60s, my grandparents' home was a haven to Black jazz musicians in New York City. Imagine today having a white jazz musician come and play a song and play well, and someone go up and say, you can't play that because that's not your culture's music. This was developed by my culture, and you can't have that. Or the idea of, you can't wear your hairstyle that way because that's the hairstyle of my culture. We see it all the time. There's this division of cultural appropriation that we're seeing. I think there needs to be more cultural appreciation than culture appropriation. Make no mistake, the culture war in America is just as important as any election in America. And the more we push back on divisive culture, the better off we're all going to be in growing this unified culture for the nation as a whole. I try.
At night, you also are an undercover vigilante. I talked today, vigilante, doing your own podcast. So I love that you are putting the word out there and trying to make a difference. Why don't you give us a little insight on your podcast?
That's very nice of you. Thank you. So I have a YouTube channel called Buffoon of the Week. You can find it on YouTube. Subscribe to it if you like. But check it out, because what we do is a review of the news of the dumbest newsmakers of the week. I'll review something that happened in the news in the past 7 days or so, and we'll discuss how buffoonish these politicians are acting, relating it to the principles we have in the book. Basically, it'll be a clip of them from some video that I find either from the news or from a primary source. You'll get to see the buffoonery in action, and then I'll discuss why I think this is buffoonish and what should be done. One of the best things I saw recently was a video of Vivek Ramaswamy, who's running for president on the Republican ticket, going to the Breakfast Club with Charlamagne tha God and his show, and discussion of his lack of public service by this woman, that was done by this woman, Teslin Figaro. And we just analyzed how dumb it was. This video, again, my channel was very small when I jump-started it, 300 subscribers or something like that. From that video, I was able to jump up to today. We're over 1,100 in, like I said, about a month and a half. That video got like 42,000 views. I was amazed at the response from people just talking about common sense. Yeah, this is dumb. This is stupid. This is why I think it's stupid. The discussion was great. So now I do videos Monday through Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern on a different topic of concern, different piece of current events, discussing how buffoonish it was. Now, again, I am by no means a news site. I'm not breaking news. It is opinion politainment, I like to call it. I'm not here to educate you on an issue. I might give you some education on an issue. We can certainly talk about political leadership and make fun and mock some buffoons, but that's about as far as we'll go. Don't rely on me for actual news coverage. But listen, we have a lot of fun doing it. I enjoy comments from everybody. It's a great thing. The name of the show is called This Week in Dumbmocracy. So give it a search on the YouTubes, check it out, and I hope everybody tunes in and likes it.
Anything else that you want to bring light to since I have you on? Anything that's pressing that really hasn't made the radar for most people or most mainstream homes that you'd like to plant out there?
I think that we're entering the silly season. We're entering the portion of the year where there's not a lot of political news coming out because it's the end of the summer. Really nothing's going to happen until Labor Day, but we are going to have some presidential debates coming. The first presidential debate is coming up very soon. I don't know exactly when this is going to broadcast, but it will be very soon from the date we're broadcasting it. Really vet all these candidates. Look for those toxic traits about their personality. Do they have a lack of self-awareness about an issue? For example, an example of that would be, the classic example I use is Elizabeth Warren, when she came out with that video talking about how she was like 1027th Native American and said that solved the issue for her. That's an example of a shocking lack of self-awareness. Look out for hypocrisy of positions if they are hyper-partisan and think that it's okay for certain things to happen on their side, but if the other side does it, it's the worst thing in the world. Look out for those people who only care about a goal, the idea of how to reach that goal, chasing the dragon, their addiction to winning. That's another toxic trait to look for. And if you want more toxic trait like this, it's all right here, guys. Read the book. It's available on Amazon for 99 cents, by the way, the ebook version. And the reason why it's for 99 cents is because I care more about the message getting out than I do about any sort of money from this book. So Schnooks, Crooks, Lies, and Scoundrels, check it out today. It's been a lot of fun talking about this stuff, and definitely enlightening, especially with the Virgin Island stuff. Nothing I ever would have imagined to look up. And it was very interesting. Good luck on unraveling all those layers.
Gene, you have yourself a great day, and I'll reach out again maybe in a year or two. Love to have another conversation. This is very insightful and great for me.
Oh, absolutely. I loved every minute of it. Thanks so much. We're going to be in touch real soon. I'm going to get you on my show as well at some point when I start doing live shows.
Sounds great. Look forward to it.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
This has been Digital Voices with Beau Tiffany, exploring deep stories from real-life guests with real-life experiences, providing insight to our listeners with every story. Stay up to date on future podcasts by bookmarking Digital Voices with Beau Tiffany.podbean.com and follow Beau on social media by searching Digital Voices with Beau Tiffany. Have an idea for a future story? Send your idea to acrmadison@gmail.com. Until next time, grab life by the horns and keep inspiring others.